Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to this presidential session, the Wallace Distinguished Lecture. My name is Alfredo Artiles from Arizona State University. I'm going to chair this session. And as a quick reminder for our colleagues at AERA who may not know about the Wallace Lecture, is one of the most distinguished lectures in the AERA annual meeting program. The lecture is expected to focus each year on the improvement of educational practice in American primary and secondary schools. And special emphasis is given to the improvement of educational services for students from low-income communities. This year we have a distinguished speaker, Professor Rubén Rumbaut. He is Distinguished Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Irvine, and currently a visiting scholar at the Russell Sage Foundation. Over the past few decades, he's directed seminal empirical studies of immigrants and refugees in the United States, from the principal studies of the migration and resettlement of refugees from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and of the education of Southeast Asian refugee youth in the 1980s, to the landmark Children of Immigrants longitudinal study with Alejandro Portes. He also directed the National Survey of Immigration Scholars in the United States in the 1990s, the Immigration and Intergenerational Mobility in Metropolitan Los Angeles study in the 2000s with a team of UC colleagues, and the second generation in middle adulthood in the 2010s with Cynthia Feliciano, which formed the basis for a book now in progress. Dr. Rumbaut has authored over 200 scholarly articles and co-authored or co-edited 18 books and special issues, including Immigrant America, a portrait, recognized as a classic in the field through its 4 editions over the past 4 decades, and Legacies, the story of the immigrant second generation, which won the Distinguished Book Award of the American Sociological Association, as well as the Thomas and Zanicki Award for Best Book in the Immigration Field. A native of Havana, Cuba, he is the recipient of the Distinguished Career Award from the American Sociological Association's International Migration Section, and is an elected fellow of both the American Academy of the Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Education. So we're in for a treat today, as we will learn from Dr. Rumbaut. The title of his talk is From Middle School to Middle Adulthood, Education and the Social Mobility of the Immigrant Second Generation in an Age of Inequality. We're also privileged, and I'm going to introduce our discussant. We'll have a discussant in the lecture, Professor Min Zhou, Professor of Sociology and Asian American Studies, and Walter and Shirley Wan Endowed Chair in U.S.-China Relations and Communications, and the founding chair of Asian American Studies Department at UCLA. Her main research interests include international migration, ethnic and racial relations, immigrant entrepreneurship, education, and the new second generation Asia and Asian American, as well as urban sociology. She's the author of Chinatown, The Socioeconomic Potential of an Urban Enclave, The Transformation of Chinese America, and Contemporary Chinese America, Immigration, Ethnicity, and Community Transformation. She's co-author of Growing Up American, How Vietnamese Children Adapt to Life in the United States, co-editor of Contemporary Asian America, and co-editor of Asian American Youth, Culture, Identity, and Ethnicity. Welcome both colleagues. Professor Rumbaut will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for Dr. Zhou to comment and share some reflections about this, and we'll have time for us to have a conversation among ourselves. So please join me in welcoming Professor Rubén Rumbaut.
Put the mic down. I'm going to be using this other thing. Okay. I'm going to be using this. Oh, so this works. We got the clicker. Thank you very much, Alfredo, for that very generous introduction. My thanks to AERA President Vivian Gadsden for the honor of inviting me to give this lecture today. A project of this nature that has been going on for more than a quarter of a century would require acknowledgments that would take up the entire period, but we don't have that kind of time today, so I will limit myself to particularly acknowledging at the bottom here my collaborators, Professor Cynthia Feliciano at UC Irvine, who is at Russell Sage with me this year working on the book that Alfredo mentioned, and Dr. Linda Borgen, without whose indispensable research collaboration and assistance, this fourth wave of the SIL study would not have been possible. We have been funded over the years by many, but this particular fourth wave that I'll be discussing today has benefited from the support of the Russell Sage Foundation, the Spencer Foundation, and the University of California at Irvine. And lastly, I want to give a shout out to my UCI colleague and also at Russell Sage this year. I think UCI is dominating Russell Sage this year, Greg Duncan, who's in the audience today, without whose last minute push I might have said no to this lecture. And so I'm here really because of Greg. When Vivian asked me to address this topic, is a topic whose relevance could not be more timely, on immigration and education at the end of the centennial of the American Educational Research Association, I was quite aware that we're meeting at a time when the meaning of American and of education and of scientific research and seemingly truth itself are under apparent assault in an era of mass migrations, narrowing social mobility and widening inequality, including educational and income and wealth inequality, and what has been called the fading of the American dream. I want to tell you today a fact-based story based on systematic longitudinal research about the fates of a large representative sample of new Americans, children of immigrants and refugees from Latin America and Asia, whom we have followed from middle school to middle adulthood, from 1991 to last year, from their mid-teens to their late 30s. Before I get going, and as a personal aside, let me add that the irony does not escape me that I came to this country speaking no English in the 8th grade. In fact, my first year here in the United States, I still think of it as a silent movie. I see moving images, but there's no sound because I couldn't understand. And that we began to follow our sample of children of immigrants when they were in 8th grade. Just a year before the birth of our son, Rubén, which has allowed me to say ever since that I not only study children of immigrants, I make them, and that's the ultimate in participant observation. Now, my co-author, my wife, Irene Tienda, the mother of our son, is here in the audience, and she's holding our 9-month-old, he just turned 9 months old, grandson Zane, who made his first plane flight last night from California just to be here for the occasion. If you have good eyesight, you can see that he's wearing a fake tie. Now, the lecture will trace the story of the education and social mobility of a unique panel of 1.5 and second generation respondents whose parents were immigrants from Mexico, the Philippines, China, India, and elsewhere in Asia and Latin America, and refugees from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, including the monk from Laos, who had settled in San Diego prior to the baseline survey of what came to be called SILS, the Children of Immigrants Longitudinal Study that Alfredo referred to in his remarks. But that story needs to be understood in the larger contexts in which it is rooted, especially since the 1970s, especially the contexts of inequality, of immigration and increasing diversity, of inequality but decreasing mobility, and the transformation of California, especially during the decade of the 80s and since, and above all of Southern California, the world's premier region of international migration today. Indeed, by 2000, California had become a majority-minority state. But it was not always so. In fact, it is a very recent phenomenon. I will get to this in just a moment, but let me go back to the point that I made about California. It's hard to believe that as late as 1960, Los Angeles was called the whitest, most Protestant city in America, with one of the least percentages of foreign-born. And yet, by 2003, of 10 million people living in Los Angeles County, the largest county in the United States, 71% were ethnic or racial minorities. That was back almost 15 years ago. 7.1 million people in LA County alone. That's more than the population of most states. And what I just said about Los Angeles applies even more so for San Diego, where the project was begun. It was called the biggest small town in the United States, and yet San Diego, by 1982, that Navy town, that largest small town in the United States, had leapfrogged past Detroit in 1982 to become the sixth largest city in the United States. The big increase in immigration since 1970, and you can see 1970 is there, it's the nadir of the foreign-born population of the United States in American history. Only 4.7% of the population of the United States was foreign-born in 1970, and since then it has been increasing significantly year after year, as has, those are the red bars, and the yellow bars are their US-born children, the children of immigrants, the second generation, which by 2014 together combined to account for 25.1% of the population of the whole country. So over a quarter of the population of the United States is of immigrant stock, is first or second generation. And that was as of 3 years ago, so that number has edged up to about 25.2 or 25.3. Zane clearly agrees, but he just stepped out. If you think of just children today, there are 70 million children in the United States today under the age of 18, and 26% of all of those children, about 18 million of them, are living in an immigrant family. They have one or two immigrant parents. So it's even more remarkable when you start looking at younger ages as opposed to the entirety of the population. Now, this big increase in immigration since 1970 has coincided with an era of widening economic inequality, so that the incorporation and prospects of social mobility of immigrants and their children has hinged on their levels of education, probably more than ever in history. The Great Recession after 2007 exacerbated the widening inequalities in income and wealth. Now, this process of increasing inequality has been accompanied by sharply constrained social mobility. That is, the higher the income and wealth inequality, in general, the lower has been the economic mobility. I won't have time to get into the whole debate about this, but let me first say a few things about this larger context of immigration, and then we'll, after getting past these contexts that I would argue are indispensable to understand the story that I'm about to tell you, we'll get into the SIL study. This first chart, as you see, illustrates just the demographic influence of immigrants and their children that has shifted over time. We're still nowhere near the third of the country that was of immigrant stock back in the early part of the 20th century. This figure goes from 1900 to the present. But nonetheless, we're talking about over 80 million people right now. That 25 point some percent is over 80 million people. That has transformed the ethnic diversity of the United States, of the population of the country, and above all, of California. Where do they come from? These are the top 10 sources of immigration in the United States today. There are about 40, as of 2015, there are 43.3 million people in the US who are foreign-born. And of them, 10 countries account for roughly 60% of the entire foreign-born population. 10 countries, 5 from Asia and 5 from Latin America. Leading the pack by far is Mexico. By itself, today it accounts for 27%. Just a few years ago, it was at 29%. There's been a decline in Mexican immigration, a return of undocumented immigrants to Mexico. And so that number has been decreasing, but still 27%. The second largest are immigrants from India, which, as you see there, account for just 5.5%. India, in just the last few years, has become the principal source of annual international migration to the United States, surpassing Mexico. And it has, the Indian increase has really taken off, especially over the last 25 years or so. It had been the Philippines that was in second place after Mexico, going back to the opening after the passage of the 1965 Act, which allowed people from the Eastern Hemisphere, including Asia, which had been barred entirely in the early part of the 20th century, to enter the country. The former colony of the United States, the Filipinos, were the first to make the most out of that opening, and they were in second place until just recently, when they have just been surpassed by India and China. The numbers for China there are just from the People's Republic of China. It does not include Taiwan or Hong Kong. And then they're followed, as you can see there, to the Philippines by El Salvador, Vietnam, Cuba, Korea, Guatemala. Those are the top 10. And I added and the Dominican Republic, and I added Cambodia and Laos, even though today they're only just under 1% of the immigrant population, because of their importance in the SIL study that we're about to discuss. Where are these immigrants located? These, again, those are the top 10 immigrant source countries, and their numbers by the last census in 2010. These are the top 3 states of settlement. And if you look at the number 1 state of residence, for all of them, for 8 out of 10, it's California, 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 California. Florida, oops. New York, oops. The Cubans and well, I'm one of the few Cubans in California. But mostly they're in Florida, and the Dominicans are mostly in New York. But you can see where the second and third are for them. So with the exception of those 2 Caribbean countries, Cuba and the Dominican Republic, largely the story of contemporary immigration is also a California story. The big change, as I said, occurred after the end of the Vietnam War and during the decade of the 1980s, which happened also to be a decade of a lot of change in California, economic expansion. Already in the mid to late 60s, the master plan of higher education was being implemented in California. New UCs were being built, including UC Irvine, UC San Diego, UC Santa Cruz, etc. And it was into that context that this massive immigration came in. And as you can see, the proportions in California are not trivial. We're talking about close to half, a third to half of all of these groups are concentrated in the state of California, and above all, in the state, in the southern part of the state. In fact, to give you a sense of how rapidly this change in the 1980s occurred, by 1990, just 30 years after LA had been the widest, most Protestant, etc. city in the United States, by 1990, fully a third of the national total of all the foreign-born, all the immigrants in the United States, who at that time numbered 20 million, a third were in California alone. Today, that number is closer to 27%. So over a quarter of the total immigrant population of the 43.3 million today are still in California. And when you add their children, their US-born children, more than half of the population of the state of California is first or second generation. And there are 38 million people in the state of California. In my campus of the UC system, the UC Irvine, we have over 30,000 students. 85% of all of our students are first or second generation. Now, immigrants are not a homogeneous lot. The most educated people in the United States today, by far, are immigrants. The least educated people in the United States today, by far, are immigrants. Here are the top 10 again. The red bar lets you know what the average is for the United States as a whole. To the left of you see India, Korea, the Philippines, China, and Taiwan, with much, much higher numbers or percents of adults who have college degrees or advanced degrees. India leads by far everybody else, with 75% of all adults born in India in the United States, and they're the second largest immigrant group, have bachelor's or advanced degrees. The largest immigrant group, Mexico, accounts for the least educated population in the United States, with only 5% of adults 25 and over having college degrees. And the bottom 4 here, from Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Mexico, are not only the least educated groups, to which Cambodians and Hmong and Lao may also be added into. They're in that neighborhood. But they're not only the 4 least educated groups, but more than half of all immigrants from those countries are undocumented. More than half of all immigrants from those countries have less than a high school education, and more than half are undocumented. So you get this double whammy, this double jeopardy of low human capital and legal status that makes their incorporation into the United States particularly problematic. As far as educational inequalities, the other part of the context that I was talking about, this is a report just released by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and you can see what has happened to 2 birth cohorts. The red bar, as you can see there, is those born between 1979 and 1982. The SILS study that I'm about to talk to you about, our respondents were born between 1977 and 1979, so they're essentially that part of that birth cohort. That's the red bar. The blue bar are those who were born in 1961 to 1964. These are, the numbers indicate the fraction of those populations who have completed a 4-year college degree or more. And you can see the 4 income quartiles. At the lowest income quartile of the blue bar, only 5% had completed college, only 9% by today. By the time you get to the top quartile, back in the older cohort, 36% had completed a college degree, 54% had completed a college degree by now. If anything, the economic inequalities are also sharpening the divide in educational inequalities. Remember that 54% figure, because it's going to come back to talk to us later. At the same time, and this figure comes from a paper that is already being widely cited. It was only released in December. I attended a talk that Raj Shetty gave at CUNY just last month, and this chart comes from that presentation and from that paper. The paper is entitled "The Fading American Dream," which I made reference to earlier, and it shows the percent of children earning more than their parents by year of birth of the children. So at comparable ages, so at approximately age 30 or so, a child born in 1940 was earning 90% more than a child than their parents. By 1980, a child born in 1980, in other words, the people we're going to be talking about today, only had a 50% chance, essentially a coin flip, to be earning more than their parents at a comparable age. It is that picture that has concerned Raschetti, an economist from Stanford, and his team of economists. They estimate that they call this the absolute income mobility measure, the fraction of children who earn more than their parents. The American dream has typically been, among other things, been defined as the expectation that children will always earn more than their parents, and so on. That has been reversed. I'll have more to say about this, the fading American dream, in the conclusion. Okay, the Children of Immigrants Longitudinal Study. What happened to, okay. The idea for the study goes back to the 1980s. Alejandro Portes and I had just completed the first edition of Immigrant America, essentially in the late 80s, and I had just completed a study of Southeast Asian refugee youth, and we wondered, well, what's the next frontier in immigration research? And we agreed, it's the children. So that idea led to a series of research proposals, and we finally got funded in 1991 for what became CILSI. We didn't know at the time it would be longitudinal, but it became longitudinal, hence Children of Immigrants Longitudinal Study. The sample was originally drawn in 2 parts of the United States, in South Florida and San Diego. You're probably familiar with the results of the earlier study that we have taken through 3 waves. The book Legacies and a companion book Ethnicities were published about a decade after that. And we have had lots of publications based on what I'm going to be talking about to you today deals just with the San Diego half of the study, where we've been able to follow the original baseline sample into middle adulthood, or their late 30s. So we started when they were in 8th or 9th grade. They were 14 years old on average at the time. They're now between 36 and 39 with an average age of about 37 or so. So we follow them wherever they may have ended up. Now, in addition to survey data and in-depth interview data, we collected Census Tract or neighborhood level data, tons of it. So we know exactly what the characteristics of the neighborhoods were where they lived, from poverty rates to you name it. We have school administrative data, GPAs, language status, free lunch status, school suspensions during every one of the secondary grades, etc. We did separate interviews with the parents, so we have tons of data. There were 4 waves of surveys and in-depth interviews that were done. The first, as I mentioned, was in mid-adolescence. The sample was drawn in all 8th grades in all schools of the San Diego Unified School District in the fall of 1991. And at that time, we obtained standardized test scores in math and reading and so on for the entire eligible sample. So at that time, they were 14.2 years old. 3 years later, we followed with a second survey in late adolescence, T2. Both of these were written surveys. Then 10 years after the baseline, around roughly 2002, when they were 24.2 years old, we followed with a third survey. Now they were not principally just in San Diego. By their mid-20s, they had gone wherever. We found them even in military bases overseas. And in addition to that, about a year after the survey, we drew a strictly representative sample of the larger sample of 134 people. And we did in-depth qualitative interviews, which produced a very rich additional amount of information. And these mixed methods have allowed us to tell a story that is very different from what you can tell using only quantifiable survey information. Finally, in middle adulthood, what I'll be reporting on now, it took us from 2014 to last February, not this February, but February 2016, to follow, of those 134 that formed the representative subsample, that in-depth longitudinal sample, we were able to locate 132 of them. One was homeless, 3 were living in Mexico, one is in prison doing life for murder, for a murder committed between T1 and T2 and a gang murder in San Diego when he was 16 years old. And we've kept in touch throughout. As you'll see in just a moment, they went all over the place. And as you must know, because you're all probably older than the ages of these young folks, the older you get, the more life itself becomes a soap opera. It becomes a telenovela. There are no simple linear stories. It's just like a Richter scale, brrr, and all kinds of stuff happen in people's lives. I think it was Mark Twain that said there's no such thing as an uninteresting life. But with survey methods, you kind of get lulled into thinking that, these are all these little linear stories, and it's not. So we incorporated a 4th wave survey, and we also did in-depth qualitative interviews with these people, regardless of whether they were homeless. One was a woman in a rehab center with group quarters with 29 other recovering alcoholics. Whether they were in Mexico, one was in Alaska. They were all over the place. One is in private practice in psychiatry in the Upper West Side of New York, just blocks from where I am at the Russell Sage Foundation. And so we got the whole range, of possibilities here. Okay, some results. Everything that follows from now on is based on that SILS in-depth longitudinal sample that we took at time 4 that I just mentioned. These are the main ethnic groups in the sample, which pretty closely represent, in fact, everything very closely represents the original baseline survey. We have done logistic regressions on our time 4 subsample and compared it against the original baseline of all the 2,000 and so on that we interviewed at that time. And there's only one variable that enters the equation at a less than 0.05 probability level, and that's whether the parents own the home or not. So we have slightly more likely to have found people whose parents had a greater level of residential stability in 1991, 92 than is the case. But other than that, for a 25-year follow-up, it's pretty remarkable how closely representative the sample is. The red bars, or orange, these days I just don't like the color orange for whatever reason, but these days, but I used it. I wasn't thinking of that, but so with my apologies for women, the orange bars are females, the blue bars are males, and these are the groups in the sample: Mexicans, Filipinos, Vietnamese, Cambodian, Lao, Hmong, Chinese, Indian, and others from Latin America, for example, from Ecuador, from Panama, from Thailand, and so forth. This is their generational status and the year of arrival in the United States. So the two light bars were born in the United States. The middle one are born in the United States with two immigrant parents, and the smaller bar is born in the United States with one immigrant parent and one U.S.-born parent, what I call the 2.5 or 2.5 generation. The purple bar here, the darker blue, is what I called, like 40 years ago, the 1.5 or 1.5 generation, people who were born in another country like me and came to this country at age 12 or less. I guess I came up with that partly because I couldn't account for myself in the literature. Second generation always referred to born in the United States children. First generation always referred to people who were adults at arrival. So where was I? I was 12 when I came. So I was in between. That's where I was. And then these are the years of arrival. These are the ones, the 45% who had always lived in the United States. And these are, if they, now their parents may have arrived, of course, earlier, or they came with their parents if they're 1.5 generation. But those who came in the late 70s, those who came in the early 80s, and those who arrived in the late 80s. And with 1980 being the peak year of arrival, especially for refugees, 1980 was the peak year of refugee resettlement in U.S. history. 168,000 refugees, mostly from Southeast Asia, came, not including the 125,000 Marielitos from Cuba that came to Florida, but we're just dealing with the San Diego sample here. These are three important aspects of their growing up in San Diego during their adolescent years. This is an example of data that we got, from census tract level data that we got from the 1990 census. We knew their addresses, so we were able to tell exactly every imaginable census characteristic of their neighborhood. This just gives you the sense of poverty rates in their neighborhoods where they lived. And it turned out that exactly a third of the sample, at that time the national poverty rate was 14.2%. The poverty rate in San Diego was just slightly less than that. This first bar are those who were living in neighborhoods whose poverty rate was less than 15%, so at the national average or better. The middle bar are those growing up in neighborhoods of 15 to 50% poverty rates, and a third of the entire sample, that orange again, is those who were living in areas of concentrated poverty. 50% or higher poverty rates, and some of them were even higher than that. The Census Bureau defines an area of concentrated poverty of spatial density of significant economic deprivation as one where 40% or more of the population are below the poverty threshold. So that's 50% who are below the poverty threshold. This is an important variable dealing with family structure. 2/3 of our respondents were in homes with two parents, two natural parents present. 1/3 were in single parent or step family or other arrangements. And finally, this is that homeowner variable that I was telling you about. Our current sample shows, 54% homeowners, 45%. The actual level of the baseline was about 51 to 52% homeowners. So you can see where the slight difference occurs. Next, what was the level of education of their parents, of their mothers and fathers? Well, as you can see, here are the mothers, here are the fathers, divvied up by whether they had less than a high school education, just a high school graduate or a college graduate. half of the mothers and 40% of the fathers had less than a high school education. And in most of those cases, they hadn't even had secondary schooling. So they included refugees from rural areas of Cambodia and Laos, for example, from rural Mexico, and so on. Only 14% of the mothers and 25 or so % of the fathers were college graduates. Many of them, for example, from the Philippines, you have nurses. The Filipinos are the only case in the sample where mothers had a higher level of education than the fathers. Most of the fathers, Filipinos in San Diego, and San Diego is the second highest concentration of Filipinos in the country, work for the US Navy. And San Diego is, just about the largest Navy base with the largest naval air station and so on in San Diego. I lived in San Diego for 23 years. I arrived there in 1969, just after the Watts riots in '65 in Los Angeles. I was in San Diego on April 29, 1992, exactly 25 years ago today, when the Los Angeles riots broke out. That was the Rodney King incident. San Diego was calm. I was working with the police throughout in San Diego, and the police difference is one reason why San Diego and LA, are very different places, even though they're just 120 miles away on that hellish freeway, especially the closer you get to past Orange County. And so that's education of the parents, which kind of corresponds with the other characteristics I mentioned later. And finally, before we turn to the actual adult outcomes, these are test scores expressed in national tertiles in math and reading scores. When these were taken in the fall of 1991, you can see that in reading, they were much less likely than the national upper tertile to do well in English, in reading, but they were somewhat about 4 points higher in math than the average for the nation. And these are their weighted GPAs in either junior or senior, when they were juniors or seniors in high school. In the second wave, when we took the cumulative weighted GPAs, A's, B's, C's, and below C, so you can see the distribution there. All right. To T4 outcomes. As I mentioned, how are we doing in time? 13. Okay, I'll speed up. But I think this is important to mention. I'm going to be focusing only now on educational attainment, what we found in their late 30s, and to some extent on earnings. But we collected data over almost 25 years ago, and patterns of change over those years on language, on religion, on political beliefs and affiliations, ethnic identities, transnational ties, intermarriage, family formation, early childbearing, arrests and incarceration, cultural practices, and lots more. If I had to tell you stories about all of the above, we'll be here long past the San Antonio fiesta. We'll need a siesta, and then we can come back for the rest. Where are they now? Can you even see that? That's supposed to be a map of the United States. Well, it shows clearly in gray there. So you'll just have to sort of pretend. But that's obviously, San Diego. And so this is where the people in the sample that I'm telling you about are. So some are here in Alaska. There are, some people in New York, including that psychiatrist who's from the Philippines. There's an accountant in Atlanta. There are people in Baltimore and in Chicago and in Texas. And then, but you see the constant, and these are in Arizona. Some of them lost their houses that they had just bought in 2007 when the Great Recession happened, like a $500,000 home, and now they're renting a dump in Arizona, and so they're over here. So it's not just about their GPA or their educational expectations in 8th grade. Life happens, and the world will have its way with you, and you have to take that also into account in telling these stories. So these are, there are 3 people living in Mexico. 2 of them work in San Diego, so they just crossed the border. Their parents live in San Diego, but they live in Mexico where it's cheaper. And so we found them in Mexico. There's a homeless guy that we interviewed, and we found them in San Diego. There are people in Temecula and places like that in Riverside County and elsewhere in Southern, this is in LA and Bakersfield. And then there are people up in the Bay Area. So you have some in San Jose and so on. And then in Oregon and Washington State. So that's where they are, and their information has to informs what we're about to cover now. If we had stopped our study when they were 24, 25 years old back in 2002 for T3, most of them were still living with their parents. They had no children. They were still going to school. The transition to adulthood these days takes a lot longer. If you're in your 30s, they're still living with you at home. You can ask me. It made a big difference to wait now till they're in their late 30s to find out what has happened to their telenovela. And you can see that only this small portion have remained single into their late 30s. Almost 1 in 10 are still cohabiting. The majority are married. Some have been divorced or separated. One is widowed. We have 2 grandmothers in our sample already who are in their late 30s. Sorry, Min. Min wants the grandchild, and so she's very envious of Tarzanito. But you'll hear from Min in just a moment. In fact, a lot of their children today are the same age, 14 or so, that they were when they entered this study back in 1991. And then these are the number of children that they have. About 36%, what happened to the, oh, here we go. 36% have no children, and the rest have between 1 and 5 children. The timing of the first birth, all of that has a lot to do with the educational story that you're about to see. This is probably the most important chart of this presentation. This is the education attained and their annual earnings in middle adulthood, when they're in their late 30s. And there are 2 people that never finished high school or got GED, so they're included in this first bar. That's high school only or went into some kind of vocational training, like they went to bartender school or beauty school. Then these are the ones that have associate degrees from 2-year colleges. Those that got bachelor's, those got master's degrees, whether MBAs, or MAs or whatever. And those that got MDs, JDs, or PhDs. So about 5% have professional or PhDs. Another, can't read this, but 15% have masters, and a third have bachelors. So if you combine those 3 bars, 54% have managed to complete and earn a bachelor's or higher degrees. 54% is the same number that as of last year, only the upper income quartile of the country had managed to finish, if you remember that slide that I showed earlier. So that's remarkably above the national average. And these are their earnings. So you can see 54% have bachelor's or higher. And in terms of earnings, the mean for the sample was 62,000 and change. The median was 50,000, and this is the distribution in terms of the annual earnings for those who had jobs, and well over 90% of them had jobs. So the data applies mostly to them. This is the level of education attained for the main ethnic groups in our study: Lao, Hmong, Cambodian, Mexican, Filipino, Vietnamese, and Chinese. The Indians were too small, but 75% of the Indians had advanced degrees, and the remaining 25% had a bachelor's. So 100% of them kind of pretty much in line with the overall national picture. And you can see the distribution here. The light bar is less than a bachelor degree. The middle blue bar is a bachelor only, and advanced degrees are the darker bar. The performance of the Vietnamese and Chinese is extraordinary. The Chinese and the Filipinos have a greater proportion of advanced degrees. In the case of the Mexicans, all of the Mexicans with quote advanced degrees have masters. So for example, one got a master's in education, now is a vice principal in a high school in San Diego. But the others are the ones where you'll find the JDs, and especially the MDs and the PhD. The PhD is Chinese. How am I doing? Then I'm going to have to just fly through this, so forgive me, but I have some remarks about implications of this that I want to have those 2.5 minutes. But I wanted to give you a comparison to the current population survey, CPS data for the nation and for Southern California and San Diego in general, so you can see how our findings compare to the findings for those particular groups, 1.5 second generation in their late 30s at the same time. These are CPS trend lines from 2003 to 2015. If you were to, this kind of will remind you of that earlier chart that I showed you by birth cohort. So people who are 65 and older and in these years, that's the percent who had completed a bachelor's. The middle bar is the percent from their 40s and 50s who had completed, and then from 25 to 39, which pretty much covers our people, the light blue bar. But even at that light blue bar, you're only talking about 30-some percent, and not that 54% that we were talking about. This is the proportion who were below the poverty line or were receiving food stamps, and you can see the effects of the Great Recession from 2008 on sharply increasing receipt of food stamps and increased poverty, which has remained kind of stable since then and has not dropped to pre-Great Recession levels. But education continued to increase during those years regardless. Comparing the sales data to that CPS data, these are the same, the Chinese, Vietnamese, Filipino, Lao, Cambodian, Mexicans for Southern California compared to our samples in San Diego. Even with merged CPS years for those particular years that we're talking about, the more recent years in their 30s, I can't get it down to just a San Diego level, except for Mexicans. You can see that for Mexicans in San Diego, according to the CPS, 23% of 1.5 and second generation Mexicans that fit the specs had bachelor's or more in San Diego. But if you go to Los Angeles or Riverside or Ventura, in other words, elsewhere in Southern California, in the greater LA area as opposed to San Diego, the percent of Mexicans with these specs that had college degrees or more was only 5%. So you can see that although San Diego is on the Mexican border, people from Mexico don't come to stay in San Diego. They keep on going to the big enclave. And that's the greatest proportion of the undocumented and so on you'll find in greater Los Angeles or even in Santa Ana, right next door to Irvine in Orange County. And so San Diego is a somewhat more select place. And the economy of San Diego also will make sure that the levels of educational attainment in San Diego in general are going to be higher than they are for other places in the United States as well as for the national average. But in any event, our data looks pretty good compared to the national average. This first bar tells you where non-Hispanic white natives of those ages, 40% of them nationally had bachelor's degree or higher. And in San Diego, 43% of San Diegans who were that age and so on, non-Hispanic white natives. Especially the groups on the left here, these three bars, are doing better than that typical standard. How come it's not advancing? It's refusing to do what I tell it to. Here we go. I had to use maybe it's running out of juice. This is education by gender, men and women. If anything, women outperform men in the sample by about 7 points in bachelor's degrees, but when you look at, this is not working. So I'll stay put here, park myself here, and just finish with the old technology. This is the effect of education on earnings. You can see how much, this is the amount in median annual earnings for those that have got less than a bachelor, a bachelor's only, or an advanced degree. And for both men and women, blue and orange, that increases. But you can see how big the gender gap is as the level of education increases. The greater the education, the wider is the gap between men and women, even though they have the same exact level of education. And even though, if anything, women slightly outperform the men overall in the SIL study. This is the education they attain by the expectations that they expressed to us when they were in from 8th to 12th grade. So these expectations were measured over 20 years earlier, and those expectations are very clearly associated with final outcomes in middle adulthood. That first bar, the light bar, are those that didn't expect that they were going to get a bachelor's. Well, 83% of them didn't get a bachelor's. To get something, it's not like if there's a will, there's a way. You can will whatever you want, but you still need a structure of opportunities to allow you to fulfill that expectation. But if you don't have the will, it doesn't matter what the structure of expectations is, there's going to be no way. And you can see that if they didn't expect something, they didn't visualize that future for themselves, that is what happened. But if they did, even those that said that they expected to get an advanced degree, they may not have gotten an advanced degree, but combined, 80-some% of them got a bachelor's or higher. Now, this is just obviously, as the higher the GPA, the greater the education attained, the higher the parental socioeconomic status, the higher the education attained. Those are, standard findings from the stratification literature, as Greg, as you pointed out. But I want to give you one suggestion of how the expectation story is important. At T3, when they were in their mid-20s, and using the entire sample, we found that GPA was the single most important predictor of highest education attainers of their mid-20s. But expectations were not only significant, but strongly significant, and more so than parental socioeconomic status, and more so than a number of other variables that are in the standard literature. So that's the power of expectations. What type of university did they attend to get the 54% of them that got bachelor's or higher? Well, as you can see, the biggest bar there is public universities, public colleges and universities, public higher ed. 6% went to private schools like USC or the University of San Diego, for example, and paid the money required. But 44% plus went to public four-year or higher universities. 8% were to for-profit universities like University of Phoenix. Others went to community college or vocational, and some got whatever higher education course they may have gotten, either in the military, or and about 18% of our sample where they or their spouse was in the military, so it was not a trivial percent, or in prison, or none. Where specifically did they go? Well, 20% of those who got their bachelor's or higher attended the University of California. 8% UCSD, 5% UCLA, 3% Berkeley, 2% were at Irvine, Riverside and Santa Cruz. Another 24% attended Cal State, California State University. Obviously the biggest bunch is right there in San Diego, so 15% went to San Diego State, 4% to Cal State San Marcos, which is in northern San Diego County. It's among the many CSUs that were also have been created during this period of time, and the others in CSUs in Long Beach, San Bernardino, Cal Poly, San Jose State, and San Francisco State. Let me try to wrap it up right now. That figure just tells you what their earnings are by type of college they attended. If you went to private college, you're making more money, but also if you went to a private college, and that's only a small number who were able to do so, your level of debt, the dark blue bar is the student debt, the student loans that they got to pay for college. The lighter blue is their current level of debt, so they're still in debt. And you can see that the for-profit places don't yield higher income, but they still yield higher debt. Now, to conclude, let me go back to something that, remember when I mentioned the Fading American Dream paper by Raj Shetty? A month after that paper, he came up with another paper with his team of collaborators, which they called Mobility Report Cards, the Role of College in Intergenerational Mobility, based on data for 30 million college students. This is big data from 1999 to 2013. Intergenerational mobility, they define it depends on both access how much you can afford to go to college, which is a function of parental income especially, and success outcomes. And based on that definition, an upward mobility rate that they define as the fraction of students who come from families in the bottom income quintile and reach the top income quintile, the top 20% of the income distribution. They are defining that as upward mobility, and then they ask, well, what colleges account for those high upward mobility rates? And this is taken from the paper. The colleges that have the highest bottom to top quintile mobility rates, those that offer both relatively high success rates and low income access, are typically mid-tier public schools. For instance, many campuses of the City University of New York, CUNY, Cal State colleges and universities like the ones that I just showed you, and several campuses in the University of Texas system. I just took this picture on a subway. I went to give a talk at NYU last month, and there's the CUNY American Dream Machine. That's the City University of New York saying, follow your dream. I had to take a picture because I need to send that to Raj Chetty because he kind of goes with this. This is an upward mobility top 10 based on Chetty's and et al. Study on mobility report cards based on that bottom quintile to top quintile upward mobility rates. And these are the top 10 of 4,700 colleges and universities in the United States. Those are the top 10. And you can see that, I don't have my glasses with me, but you can see that numbers 3, Cal State Bakersfield, 4, the University of California at Irvine, 5, Cal State, Cal Poly Pomona, 8 is San Jose State, 10 is Cal State Long Beach. And you also have Baruch College, CUNY, number 9, and Stony Brook at SUNY at number 7. And so, in other words, these are precisely the trampolines to upward mobility are public higher ed universities like these. But what is in fact happening in the country? Well, especially since 2008 and the Great Recession, there has been a very significant disinvestment at the state level in public higher education. In other words, a declining support for public higher ed, which you can characterize as penny wise but pound foolish. These are the 15 largest states of the United States. The average for the country is 18%, that's the yellow bar. So during that period from 2008 to 2016, states in the US generally have cut per student funding in public universities and colleges by 18%. At the very top with the smallest cuts is California, only 3% for that period, which has a lot to do, I think, with the story I've been telling you, the SEAL story I've been telling. New York, 6%. But then you get to the North Carolinas, Georgia's at 20% and 25% or near for states from Michigan to Florida. 33% cuts in Pennsylvania, and over half of the per student education costs in Illinois and Arizona. So, instead of giving you these various lessons learned, let me conclude just with these, this last minute or so of remarks. The SEAL story, of course, is not solely one of tenacious triumphs and happy endings. Our diverse sample, as I mentioned to you, has had their share of life's problems. There have been DUI arrests, drug problems, divorces, bankruptcies, and many of the other things that I have mentioned. But if you take a random sample of any population group, of people in their late 30s from every nook and cranny of this vast country, you will learn their tales of human foibles and follies and failures, as well as their successes. Their telenovelas, if you will, are full of everything, it seems, except simple linear stories. Taken as a whole, however, and knowing how far they've traveled, when you consider we're talking about Hmong and Cambodians and so children of the killing fields of Cambodia are part of the sample. When you take that into account, theirs has been a compelling, redemptive story of upward educational and economic mobility in an age of inequality, one in which education has played a central role, particularly the role of public higher education in a state such as California, which in the course of absorbing unprecedented numbers of immigrants and refugees of every hue and caste, provided the crucial scaffolding of opportunity for hopeful strivers. California, the state with by far the largest size and share of international migrants, has been transformed in the process, to be sure, but also in the end for the better. Crime is at historic lows, despite all that you hear about what happens when you have concentrations of immigrants. It is the 6th largest economy in the world. And truth be told, after last November, I've never been prouder to be a Californian by adoption than I am today. The SIL story, I hope, has significant implications for what is possible in this country, even at a time of disinvestments in public higher ed, and at a time of another reactive spasm of collective xenophobia against immigrants and refugees, whether from Mexico or Syria this time, instead of the Irish and Italians and Chinese of yore, or Muslims this time, instead of Catholics and Jews. In other words, those who bore the brunt of yesterday's bigotry against the foreign-born, alongside the most native and the most discriminated against of Americans, the first Americans and the second, the African Americans. Education alone cannot be the solvent of deep-seated fears and hatreds, but it is a necessary condition for a more recent and inclusive society and for a better, not a bitter, tomorrow. Thank you very much. Would you like this or the microphone?
Thank you very much. And also thank you, Rubén, for a data-rich, informative, humorous, and intellectually stimulating lecture. You make the second, third generation. I am envious of you. I raised the 1.5 generation, and at this moment, I'm hoping to put pressure for my child to make the new second generation. But you know how effective tiger parenting is, right? Okay, as a discussion, I would like to do 2 things. So first, I would like to recap some of the important points in Professor Rubén's lecture. I then briefly offer my comments on the continuing significance of the new second generation. There are several important points, including the punchline, which he shaded at the very last slide on the SILS findings. So there are several important points highlighted by Professor Rumbaut. First, at the larger context, that is, at the national level, there has been persistent inequality by gender, race, and social class. As shown in the overall college attainment rates among adult Americans in the US Census data, 50% of women had a college degree or higher compared to 41% of men. Similarly, 72% of Asian students earn an associate or higher degree compared to 54% white, 31% African American, and 27% Latino American students. And 54% of students from high-income families earn a bachelor's degree or more compared to only 36% of students from low-income families. Second, the vast majority of students in America today go to college. They are overwhelmingly attending public universities and colleges, as shown by Professor Rumbaut. Community college and also public universities are a viable path for social mobility. But fewer students graduate, and still fewer graduate on time. Third, the rates of absolute income mobility, that is the proportion of children who earn more than their parents at the same comparable age cohort, are declining over time. Now, the findings from cross-sectional data reveal troubling trends at the national level. However, the profile of the new second generation seems more promising. based on the analysis of data from 4 waves of CILS, the Children of Immigrant Longitudinal Survey, that follow individuals in San Diego from early adolescence to middle adulthood. Professor Rumbaut concludes that there are no signs of second generation decline. And among members of the second generation in general, and in San Diego in particular, there is evidence of substantial upward mobility across 20 years of their life course. The most striking evidence in the CILS-4 analysis is that 54% of the respondents in CILS had attained a BA or higher degree. However, there are big discrepancies in college graduation rates between CILS data and the current population survey data, especially for the Vietnamese. So 78% of the Vietnamese in CILS-4 had a college degree or more, compared to 55% in the CPS data. And Mexicans, 41% had a college degree or more, compared to 24% in the CPS national data. And then Professor Rumbaut also found that the key determinants for socioeconomic outcomes in middle adulthood are the usual variables: family SES, educational expectations, and GPAs in secondary schools. And also he highlights the importance of the accessible and affordable public education that has played an important role on second generation mobility. Now, if the second generation is doing fine, why should we continue to study the new second generation? What is at issue here and now? Here is my, some of my comments for the sake of stimulating discussion. So immigration to the United States has not yet slowed down, and the new second generation is growing and is still predominantly young. As Professor Rumbaut just showed us, today's immigrants and their children constitute a significant segment of the American population, more than a quarter. By now, the older cohorts of the new second generation have already matured into adulthood, middle adulthood, and 2 of them are even grandparents. And many of these older cohort have teenage children of their own. However, because of contemporary immigration is still at very high tide, showing very little sign of subsiding, the new second generation has remained predominantly young and at a relatively large cohort of them have not yet come of age. So I argue that the existing findings about the new second generation are not conclusive, and that the study of the new second generation remain highly significant. Because social inequality is continually reproduced by immigrant selectivity and reinforced by America's systems of stratification, some segments of the new second generation are still at risk of blocked, stalled, or downward mobility, while many are doing well. Here, I would like to point out the changing context in which members of the new second generation grow up, and we know that these contexts are very different from that of the past. So that's why we have a need for continuing to study the new second generation to develop new approaches, paradigms, and theories. So the global context or the context of exit are constantly impacted by globalization in both the United States and in the countries of origin, and by the ever-tightening interconnectedness between and across places of origin and destination at the level of the nation-state, diasporic and ethnic communities and families. So these global contexts shape the context of exit for contemporary immigrants and creating the phenomenon of immigration selectivity. The local context or the context of reception are also being transformed by both immigrants and natives, most notably into majority-minority settings and into super diversity. Super diversity refers to increased diversity, not only between immigrants and ethnic minority groups, but also within them. And also today, the local contexts include not just California or the traditional gateway cities of immigrant resettlement, but also many new destinations across the country in the Midwest and in the South. This global and local context will continue to evolve and change in the years to come, with significant implications for persistent social inequality. So in the study of the new second generation, I would like to bring out the issue of immigrant selectivity, which we think is an important structural factor that is shaped by the context of exit and shaping the context of reception. So here I would like to give an example from our research that try to explain the extraordinary educational attainment of Asian Americans from our recent book, co-author with Jennifer Lee, and talk about how immigrant selectivity reproduce social inequality. So immigrant selectivity, we mean high selectivity. That is the work by our colleague, Cynthia Feliciano. So of all the immigrant group except for Mexicans, Cynthia shows that most of the immigrants group are highly selected. That means an immigrant group's average level of education is higher than compatriot in the sending country. But we also want to bring more nuance in the concept of selectivity to develop the concept of hyper versus hyperselectivity. So hyperselectivity refers to the proportion of not just the year, the average year, the proportion of college graduates in an immigrant group that is not only higher than the compatriot in the homeland, but also in the host society. And the hyperselectivity is just the opposite. So you will see, take for example, Chinese are hyper-selected, Vietnamese are highly selected, and Mexicans are hyper-selected. And selectivity has important consequences on social mobility outcome. So in our book, we highlight some of the notable effects of hyperselectivity. One is for a hyperselected group, that is the Asian American group, hyperselectivity equips a group with favorable starting point, and it enables the group to construct a particular cultural frame conducive to educational attainment. And also it increased the group's ability to generate ethnic capital to support and reinforce that cultural frame, and as well as increase a group's ability to access to symbolic capital, which means the positive perception and positive stereotyping. And then it leads to achievement paradox. Because I don't have time, I want to sum up with 3 observations. And that 3 observations is what we have developed in the concluding chapter of our book with Carl Bankston, The Rise of the New Second Generation. So first, the demographic shift of America continued to evolve, largely due to continually high immigration. In the next 4 years, as shown in the projected population, in the next 40 years, America is very different. So this figure shows that there will be more than as many Hispanics as non-Hispanic whites, as non-Hispanic blacks than by by 2060, and that Asians will be 2/3 of non-Hispanic whites by then. Together, there will be almost as many Hispanics and Asians as non-Hispanic white. So more importantly, there is a very high correlation between race and class. So second, there is no question that members of the new second generation are culturally fitting into American society, and they are structurally moving beyond the status of their immigrant parents. So the trend of intergenerational mobility is quite obvious. Third, members of this new second generation are adapting to and integrated into the nation's highly stratified social and economic structures, not only family, but also group social status upon arrival that has to do with immigration selectivity, affect how well they integrate, and also will reproduce social inequality by race. So these observations are both optimistic and not so optimistic. What concerns me, my colleagues, and other scholars and policymakers is that the long-term prospect of block mobility continues to be a lived reality for today's new second generation. My colleague Eddie Tears and Vilma Ortiz studies show that the difficulties for the descendants of Mexican immigrants are due to exclusion from mainstream social structures rather than to the clash between pre-existing American culture and the culture of ethnic groups. The idea of block downward or store mobility enunciated by Herbert Gann's second generation decline, Tears and Ortiz generations of exclusion, and Portis and Joe's segmented assimilation suggests that the emergence of chronic poverty and high correlation between poverty and race in the United States in urban areas as well as in new destinations means that the children of immigrants cannot be expected to move steadily onward and upward following a single path. As they assimilate into American society from the segmented assimilation point of view, some are likely, some and a significant segment of the minority second generation. Some are likely to be absorbed into the most underprivileged segment of society. Our understanding of the current population, current second generation and its descendant is that it is in a much more complex situation that can be explained by uniformly optimistic or uniformly pessimistic interpretations. As the children of immigrants fit into their land of birth, they not only adapt to this land, they also reshape it. Predicting the future is always risky, but a good way to conclude is to try to think about what kind of America the children of contemporary immigrants may build, and to which these children make contribution. Thank you.
I'm going to leave this here. Thank you very much, both colleagues, for this intellectually enriching and stimulating talks. I'm going to ask Professor Rumbaut to come to the stage for addressing comments and questions from the audience. We're going to open it up now for comments. I'm going to ask, for the sake of time, we have a few minutes, that you state your questions or comments rather briefly so that we have more time for more people to participate. Yes.
So I'm Peter Keel with the University of Pennsylvania Center for the Study of Race and Equity in Education. I'm a Cambodian American scholar. But before I became a scholar, I was a child of two political refugees, and so you know the story. So there are two questions, very quickly. So the first is, I'm wondering if you can unpack a little bit more the stories of the Laotians, Hmong, and Cambodians, particularly if we're looking at educational attainment, in the context of debunking the model minority myth, which is something that my work really attempts to push forward, because I think there is a danger in the aggregation of data where we talk about Asian Americans in a way that makes them seem as though they are high achieving. And so I'm wondering if you can address this issue in particular. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I can certainly address the issue, although it would take us far afield to go into the specific cases of the Hmong, the Lao, the Hmong in San Diego versus the Hmong in Fresno versus the Hmong in St. Paul, the Hmong who has a PhD, the Hmong who don't, the Hmong who are in the Central Valley of California, etc. And I could say the same about Cambodians and the oceans. Each of these groups, there's internal ethnicity. I mean, among Cambodians, there are also minority groups of Cambodians. There are mixed ethnic groups of Cambodian Vietnamese, Cambodian Lao, etc. There are Muslim groups within the Cambodian population that some of them came to Orange County. So one-size-fits-all categories are a very bad thing to begin with if you want to understand the lives of people. This country has a very bad national bad habit of lumping everybody into 5 categories: black, white, Asian, Latino, or American Indian, or perfect. In fact, I've suggested in print long ago that the national motto should be changed from a pluribus unum to a pluribus quinque, out of many 5, because you have to fit one of these 5 boxes. But what is white? I mean, that is the most sponge term to end all sponge terms category, or black or Asian and so on for that matter. The minority myth, the myth of the model minority, that by the 1980s, in 1987 in August, there was a Time magazine cover, those Asian American whiz kids. They were the children of the hyper-selected Asian immigrants that had taken advantage of changes in immigration law for high-skilled, highly educated parents to come to the United States, and that's what Min Jo was talking about a moment ago. But there are also many children of refugees, children of the killing fields of Cambodia, the Hmong who were pre-literate. I mean, I did the largest studies of Southeast Asian refugees in the United States I carried out in the 1980s. I went back to Cambodia. I went to Vietnam with some of the folks who work with me in these studies. And I know firsthand, for example, of interviewing a 54-year-old Hmong, very highly respected clan leader who was pre-literate, not just illiterate, but pre-literate. They had no idea what letters and numbers were. The Hmong have been described as a group that came from the pre-industrial to the post-industrial in one plane flight. And this clan leader, who was being thumbprinted on the back of a welfare check, said to us through an interpreter, "Look, you have 2 eyes, we have 2 eyes. You have 2 ears, we have 2 ears. But we don't know, we don't see what you see, and we don't hear what you hear, because your world is connected to letters and numbers, and we don't know what those are." I mean, it took me away, because I just take literacy and numeracy just for granted as a way to begin to understand something. And the very idea of lumping all of these extremely diverse groups of people, from those from India to the Hmong, and say these are Asian Americans and there's a general pattern that applies to them, is completely absurd. It's absurd. But so it's absurd to say the same thing of, quote, Latinos. There's not even a nation called Latino. You don't migrate from Latino. They don't even speak Latin in Latino. Look, I was born in Latin America, and I took Latin through senior year in high school. So I'm as Latino as a Latino could possibly come, and I'm here to tell you that that's just a figment and a pigment of the American imagination. And if you lump everybody and then try to say the Asians are this and the Latinos are that, you are just dealing in one-size-fits-all categories that will not aid understanding. So I'm with you on, some say that the world is divided into splitters and lumpers. I'm a splitter. I like unpacking things. But there's something to be said also about being able to see broad general patterns. And the task for social science and for understanding is to combine both and get to the truth. I like mixed methods, as you saw. I mean, I didn't get a chance to tell you much about the qualitative data, because it aids in understanding well beyond just general patterns.
We had a couple of hands here. Did I miss you? Okay, let's go here.
Yes, ma'am.
So you told a story of the advantages of a higher education system that is successful and provides access. Have you talked with the boards of higher education, with the policymakers around higher education in California? Do they know, are they aware of this kind of work?
Well, I think Greg Duncan just left. I was going to throw the ball back to Greg. The chancellor of the University of California, Irvine, for example, is completely well aware. So are all the chancellors of all the 10 campuses of the UC system and the president of the University of California, and the same goes for all the Cal States, etc. The CUNY system, when I went to that talk last month at the Graduate Center, former Mayor Bloomberg was there. Raj Shetty had once been a Bloomberg scholar. He went to Harvard before he went to Stanford. The president of the City University of New York was there. The chancellor was there. They are completely aware of the importance of that. They're completely aware of what's happening with the patterns of disinvestment, of declining support for public higher education, what I call penny wise but pound foolish. State legislatures find it very easy to just cut that as opposed to something else, given the politics of the here and now, the immediate politics of who's going to get what votes for, get elected for what, and they're not looking down the line. If you look down the line, one of the things I try to say is that public higher education for children of immigrants who are not, by and large, the richest of the rich don't immigrate. They don't need to immigrate. Neither do the poorest of the poor, for that matter. As Min said, immigration is a highly selective process. There are over 7 billion people on this planet. Only 3% of humanity are international migrants. 97% are stayers. They're living in the countries where they were born. And even among refugees, there's selectivity involved. They tend to be young, intrepid, ambitious strivers, who may be too young to know any better about what's awaiting them in the context of reception, but that shapes a particular. But even those who come as undocumented have to go through layers of selection. It's not easy to leave everything behind and move to another country, even under the most propitious of circumstances, let alone under the least propitious of circumstances. And those who finally make it are a highly selected population. How you take advantage of that motivation with a structure of opportunities is up to the context of reception to provide. So it's not that the politicians are not aware of it. It's that some choose not to want to become aware of it. Others remain totally ignorant of it, and others dwell in a alternative facts reality where none of what I said here today has will make one iota of difference in the outcome. Yeah. Last one?
Yes, one more.
Oh, Los Angeles. Did you know that for men, Cal State LA was the top school in the country in upward mobility in the Chetty study for men?
The comment regarding the census categories, the 5 categories. I'm an immigrant, Iranian immigrant in the United States, and we are white. Because of the category Middle Eastern and European is a white, and this is the reason we are ignored and irresistible to receive the access to the federal grants in university and college.
Well, so are all Arab populations, anyone, not just from Iran, but from Egypt and from Syria and so on. Do you know where the Census Bureau, in its wisdom, draws the line between white and Asian? Is the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. So if you're in Pakistan, you're Asian. If you're in Afghanistan, you're white. Now, why that? I wrote a paper since the 1970s. I've been telling my students in classes in comparative race and ethnic relations that race is a pigment of our imagination. And so I'll leave it at that because I think we're out of time.
I wish we had 2 more hours, but join me in thanking Professors Rumbaut and Joe, please.
Thank you.
Thank you.